Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Deployed Engineer podcast. And today I have with me Eric Nusbaum. Eric is a person I've long wanted to speak to. He is the co-founder and CEO of CardSight AI. He's building the infrastructure for the next generation of collector technology, doing some really cool, innovative, fun stuff in that space. Previously, he's been the owner of consulting company. He did a lot of fintech consulting. He's been the vice president in banking and wealth management for like a number of years, really vast experience. And he's been the CTO as well before that. And I could keep going. And all I want to say is like a great leader. I've worked with Eric before. I really wanted to learn from him today. Is there anything else you want to add, Eric?
Well, geez, you're gonna glaze me up for a half hour. Let's stop now. I mean, geez, it's just too much. I appreciate the intro. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to reconnect with you, and happy to just share some experience.
Yeah, for sure. So I just wanna, get to know like how did you get about to come up with the idea of CardSight AI, and how did you
Yeah.
think that this was gonna be cool and it's gonna be actually like a business, right? Because there's one is like, oh, tinkering, and then you're like, okay, I want to make this, useful to everyone. Like, how
Yeah.
did you go about that?
Yeah, it's always funny. I always preface that I always tell people I'm a software developer by trade. I'm an executive by accident. So this is something I kind of fell into, and I'll tell you, like it's really just like a lot of other startups and a lot of I share a very common story where somebody just kind of fell into it. You kind of fall into this opportunity or fall into this idea. And it really started when, in about November of for the consulting firm I was with separated. We separated part of ways, and I kind of took some time off. And it's so funny. I've been a trading card collector for a long time when I was a kid, and a friend of mine, and who is now my co-founder, he's also a trading card collector. We're like, hey, like maybe there's a card show coming to our town. Maybe we should go check it out. So, I did kind of what anyone would do. Like I downloaded all the apps. I thought I was going to be ready for this. I was going to be really informed and have everything I needed. And I got to the card show, and it became really apparent to me that the technology just wasn't meeting collectors where they were at, sort of out in the field. Vendors were still looking at prices on the eBay app because there was no good centralized trusted source for pricing. The card identification, because again, like I hadn't been in the hobby for over a decade plus. And so like I was trying to look up cards like, well, what's this card? I remember seeing this card. What's that? And a lot of the card identification technology reminded me a lot of trying to deposit a paper check in your banking app, where it's like, all right, put it inside of the box. It's got to be well lit. It's got to be on a solid background. And maybe we might tell you what card it is. And it just became really apparent to me that there was an opportunity there. So again, necessity is mother of invention. I wanted this ability. The hobby in trading card collectibles has grown so much where there's millions and millions of different types of cards out there. I don't know them all. And so I'm like, well, I need a way to know what's going on. So I had done some computer vision work at my consulting firm, and I'd been working in AI for the last 3 years prior. And so I was like, let's see if we can try to combine these things, right? Actually building out some computer vision, building out some AI. And over time, what I realized that there was a really big opportunity with kind of approaching with a different type of solution. I think the solution that the industry had put in place was sort of a one shot, like, did we get it right? Yes or no? Where I think there was an ability to sort of work towards a solution and vision using AI. And so over time, we started kind of building out our system and sort of building out these models and building out these, ways to identify trading cards. And we tried different solutions. Like we've kind of prototyped over a lot of things. We prototyped with Azure's computer vision platform, with AWS's computer vision platform. And we settled on a technology that we really feel gave us sort of a competitive edge in the marketplace. And what we've really spent the last year and a half building, I'm sure you know this as well with working in AI yourself, it's not even necessarily what you've built. It's the processes and the things that you build behind the scenes that make you and allow you to go faster, right? And so I always tell people like, look, what we've built with computer vision, I don't think is necessarily revolutionary. No one's done it before, but all the back end processes we put in place, the internal tooling we've built that allow us to move rapidly on this, but not just build a computer vision platform, but really meet collectors where they're at. Like we always say, like, if you have a card, just take a picture of it out in your hand wherever you are. And our system's able to identify it in not 3 to 4 seconds. Our system can identify it in about 300 milliseconds, which is about as fast as you can blink your eye, So just like everyone at the time, and again, this was probably early 2025, we were like, oh, well, maybe we'll build an app. We'll be the next app in the app store. We want to put our app out there. We started looking, and like there were some apps in the marketplace like Collects, COLLX was a big collector app. They just closed a $10 million Series A in March of 25. And I'm like, I can't compete with that. I'm not going to be able to compete with their marketing spend. I can't get the top 3 spaces in the App Store. And I thought to myself, well, instead of fighting the war for the top spot in the App Store, why don't we just be the arms dealer that's selling the weaponry and the guns to the people selling the top space in the App Store, right? And so we kind of pivoted our goal of, instead of being, the app ourselves, is why don't we build the infrastructure that any app that wants really world-class collectible identification would integrate with us. And we sort of, and what we really placed our chip on the table also, that's sort of the B2B side of things, but really the B2C side is like, this was again early 2025, where Replit and Claude Code were really just starting out, Bolt and all those, Lovable. And we kind of put our chip on the table saying, we bet that there will be more builders tomorrow than there is today. And those builders are going to need something that the AI cannot build for them, right? AI is phenomenal at building really great UIs, really great apps, really great workflows. But when it comes to things like data and card identification and service type data, there's no real provider for that. So we thought there was a huge opportunity there. And actually, we're seeing there's a huge opportunity there to really be sort of that data provider and infrastructure for that next generation of trading card apps, like you're saying, where today there's maybe 5 really great collectible apps on the market. A year from now, maybe we want there to be 100 of them. And I love that 80, if 80 of them were powered by us, and we think that that's where AI is really going to play a role in that, allowing people to rapidly create their vision for the collectible space in the hobby.
Wow, that's interesting. It's like building the Stripe, but for that that layer, like the
Exactly.
infrastructure for so folks can just tap into that. And yeah, that makes so much sense. That's brilliant. This is a brilliant insight. How do you how do you move, because you've been an engineer before and you moved into all these ranks, and then now you're a founder. How do you get over the engineer curse where you could have built anything, right? You can
Mhm.
you want to build this, you can build that, you want to add so much stuff, but eventually you have to be grounded and understand the limitations and move towards a mindset where you try to look at how useful something will be and how people will pay for it. So how do you navigate that?
It's interesting. I always tell people I got into leadership and management because earlier in my career I worked for too many shitty managers and too many shitty leaders. And I thought to myself, maybe there's an opportunity for me to do this better. Like if I don't like how I'm being led or how I'm being managed, maybe I could set that example for how to be an engineering leader. And I think that, that my my basis of a background in software development really grounded me in how I lead technical departments. I've always told people, and very transparent, that I've always wanted to build the departments that I, Eric, the leader, would want to be a part of as a software developer, right? Like I want to build teams that I would want to be a part of. I want to have processes that I, as a software developer, would want to be a part of. And I think it's easy for folks to kind of get lost in the sauce a little bit when they get promoted into vice president or promoted into these leadership roles, to kind of lose that grounding, lose sort of why they got into the career that they're in. Like I got into software development because I truly have a passion for building things in software. Like when I was growing up, again, not to date myself, but like my family's first computer was a TRS-80, and went from the TRS-80 to the 286, and actually working in DOS. I remember our 286 it was an 8 megahertz with 1 megabyte of RAM. And I was blown away at how fast it was compared to the TRS-80, and writing programs and in first QBasic and then Pascal. And again, that curiosity and that wanting to build is why I got into this industry. And I'm saying that I always say that that's sort of my grounding principles, to never forget why I do what I do. I think, and I understand, like, people who have families or children, like, it's like, look, I need my paycheck. I can't risk this. And they'll make maybe not the best decisions, as a leader or a manager for their software developers. But I've always tried to put my grounding and foundation as a software developer first, and let that be my guiding principle for how I lead departments. Now, to your question of how do I make the transition from software developer to leader, honestly, number one is understanding your strengths and weaknesses. I'll tell you, like, even at CardSight AI, my co-founder that I founded the company with, he is a product person, right? Because I know I am a terrible product person. I'm not good at product stuff or creating requirements or getting customer feedback. Like I am no good at that, right? I want to, so I always joke with people that I'm not the what we're going to build, I'm the how we're going to build it, right? Like you go figure out what we're going to build, I'll figure out how we're going to deliver that solution, right? So that's usually the biggest transition I always tell people when they're kind of moving from software developer to leadership roles is really understand your strengths and weaknesses and find people who can complement you and help you there. Like even in consulting, I used to laugh that I'm great when I go to clients and doing the hand wavy presentations and getting up on the whiteboard and doing all this stuff. But I need someone there who's like a business analyst or someone to actually write down what we talk about and actually take the notes because I'm going to forget everything, right? Like I'm going to forget all of it. But knowing that that was my weakness, I think really helps because then you're able to kind of build a holistic solution for yourself to support yourself in that leadership role, right? Not try to, fool yourself into thinking you're good at everything. Like it's just being open and honest with yourself about, look, I'm really good at this. I am really terrible at this. So I'm going to make sure I get the proper support I need in this area.
That's interesting. Yeah, I just had a question pop up, right, about CardSight. You're building like while you're trying to be modest with saying, "Oh, this is like something that anyone could put together." And it's about the process. I do think that there's innovation behind this because you're building that infrastructure and like you're thinking a lot about its reliability, its scalability, all that stuff, right? But like first and foremost, like there's a level of R&D that goes into it, right? And when you're building something like this, like it could take 6 months, it could take 1 year, it could take 2 months, whatever. So how do you like scope that? I'm just wondering because you have to like, you could go and say, oh, I experimented these 5 things, right? And some things have pros, have cons for what you want, but like you kind of have to scope that, right? Because unlike, when you have a requirement set, you have to just you implemented that, right? This is an open space. So what's your framework for that?
It's funny. There's a song by an artist named Spose. One of the lyrics he talks about it's life is just good decisions and dumb luck. So I think some of that goes into being in a startup as well. On the good decisions side, I always talk about and my gray hair gives me away, but I've been in this industry now for a while, and over the 25 plus years I've been in software and design, I've learned some lessons, right? And I've learned some lessons the hard way. Like the biggest lessons I've ever learned in my career are from my biggest fuck ups, right? Like my biggest mistakes taught me the most. And so I know, and my gray hair lets me know that I know now how to not make those mistakes again, right? So I always tell people it's the difference between wisdom and knowledge, right? Knowledge comes from a book. People graduate college or university with a lot of knowledge, right? Wisdom comes from experience. Wisdom comes from actually being out there in the field and putting that knowledge to use and learning in practice. Here's how things are different. The way I break it down is that again, knowledge is knowing a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to use it in a fruit salad, right? Like that's the difference there. So when heading into a startup, especially like CardSight, while it was sort of a new frontier for me, kind of being my first foray into AI and computer vision, I do have years of experience to lean on when it comes to infrastructure, system design, how to stand up resilient production systems, how to set up a system that's scalable from the get-go. What are some common pitfalls where it's like, okay, I'm working with a database. What do I need to make sure when I'm designing the DDL for that database that I make sure it's scalable over time and I don't have to go back and change things after the fact? Even working with AI assistants like Claude Code, like sometimes Claude or Codex get really aggressive in some of its optimizations. And I'll tell like, nope, like we're not doing that right now. We're going to pull it back in. We're going to keep it a simple solution. Like I'm old enough in my career to know that sometimes the simplest solution is the most elegant solution, not the most complicated code, not the most hardest to read code, just the simplest solution. So, part of it is the good decisions from experience, kind of knowing what we've done in the past. And sometimes it's just dumb luck that we tried something and it just happened to work, right? So I'm not going to discount that as well and say I know the answers to everything. I don't. And it's so funny. Organizations talk about we want to fail fast. We want to fail fast. Ed Catmull, who's the former CEO for Pixar, he would always say that, our job as leadership is to not prevent failure. Our job as leadership is to promote and provide the capacity to recover quickly when failure occurs, right? And so that is really how I view even working at a startup is expect yourself to fail, but set yourself up to recover quickly when that failure does occur so you can learn quickly from the mistake and then move on to the next solution.
Coming back to like some of the, you've seen like computers when they were really dumb, and now you see computers getting really smart, right? So over that period, right, there's all these builders like myself, you yourself, right? And you've seen like way more like you've seen decades of software and like all this technology evolving. What's your what's your take on like how things are going right now with all the vibe coding and people using AI to write software? Some people say, oh, like the future in 10 years, 5 years from now, there'll be no software engineers. Like, what's your thought process seeing this,
It's interesting. There's a great line from Ted Lasso where like he's talking about interacting with people. It says, "Be curious, not judgmental." Right? Like when you're talking, where you're in an adverse situation, be curious, not judgmental. I give the same advice to people in software development, whether it was 30 years ago or today, is to be curious. Right? So the one thing that I'm seeing happen is that there seems to be a lack of curiosity these days and more of a focus on the solution. I'm not curious why this solution works or how this solution works. It works. I'm moving on to my next thing. Like Claude Code has solved the problem. I'm moving on to my next thing. Codex has fixed that issue for me. I'm moving on to my next thing. But do you understand why it fixed or how it fixed it? Is that a good fix? What was the actual problem? I do see what's happening now is a lack of curiosity and more of a hyper focus on delivery. And so I think that is probably the biggest problem that people who are early in their career, junior devs, junior IT professionals, are losing by using these AI tools is it's not sating what I have is this curiosity. Again, like when I was growing up, I drove my mother nuts because I was the kid taking apart everything in the house because I wanted to see how it worked. Like I was taking apart clocks, I was taking apart radios. I wanted to see how it worked. And that parlayed directly into my career in software development because I was always getting into the low level stuff. I was the one when I was a kid, like hex editing my save game files so I could have infinite gold, or, using a decompiler to see the actual assembler code that's running behind the scenes when my program is running. Like that's the stuff that I dove into because I was very curious of how that worked. And that has played out well for me in my career because I do have, because of that, a deeper understanding of how these systems actually work, how AI actually works, how these LLMs actually come to their results, how when I deploy my code to a web server, what's actually happening on that server. And so it's a bit of a double-edged sword these days because I think with AI, there's such a focus on delivery now that number one, people are not curious how that code works or how that solution works. But number two, organizations, and I think Jensen Huang mentioned this recently, that like the junior developer pipeline is just broken right now. There's no junior developer pipeline because I think people who are in the junior part of their careers aren't being given the opportunity to be curious. Like if the expectation to your point is like, I got to pick up 3 Jira tickets every day and I have to deliver those results. I don't have the time to sit down and figure all this stuff out, then while you are delivering value, or Claude or Codex is delivering value, you as a professional are not growing in your knowledge and your wisdom that comes through the experience of doing that, right? And so I think one of the things I'm seeing generationally occurring is that people are kind of losing that curiosity. I think it's because they don't have the time for it. I think they're not given the time to be curious, but really wanting to really fundamentally understand how the thing I just built actually works. Like again, back in the day, if we wrote a C++ routine, you ran it through the compiler, you wanted to see what assembler it generated for your routine. And if it wasn't optimized, you might go in there and write some inline assembly for that routine if you want it to be very fast, right? Like that kind of curiosity I don't think exists anymore. And I'm not sure if it's a cultural thing in technology, how as a technology culture we've evolved, or if the tooling is pushing us away from that. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I think I like that idea of, being curious instead of just being judgmental. It makes so much sense, right? And it kind of points to the craft, like how much you love your craft, because it's like if you peek under the hood, then like, and you understand it, then that's where the real engineering is. Because as much as you could tell an agent, hey, go make me this website, there's so much that goes under like making a good site and making it optimized, frameworks to use. I feel like people that curiosity that has to be there to become a good engineer, which I totally agree with. But in terms of curiosity, right, like when it comes to curiosity, like how has your learning style changed? Because those good old days, I can also say good old days, because you used to like get that squiggly line of code like saying, oh, syntax error or something, and then you have
Yeah,
to, yeah.
please. I remember a time before even IntelliSense. What are you talking about?
Wow, okay.
You know, it's interesting. What I've seen evolve, especially, and this is more of a generational thing too, is that back in the 90s and the early 2000s, software development, I think, was very much a left brain exercise. It was very logical, very analytical. People got into software development because they liked maths, they liked algorithms, they wanted to learn routines and put things in place. And I think what you've seen over time with tooling that has come out, whether it's IntelliSense, whether even it's AI, whether it's, all these helpers out there, is that you've seen a push to more right brain people joining the craft, right? More creative folks. Like, I'm sure you probably work with a lot of people who are musicians or play an instrument, or people who are artists, or people who view software development as a creative outlet, not an analytical outlet or an analytical or logical practice. And I think that's changed a lot too in how the tooling we have developed for code has happened. So, and again, I'm not saying that's a lot of like curiosity. I have seen that in my years as kind of a generational shift where, like, of course, you still see people with logical, analytical brains working in IT and technology, but you definitely see a lot more creative people. And I think that viewing software development as a creative outlet is healthy. It's a healthy thing because it is a creative outlet. But I also, to your point, I think it draws us away from, I don't necessarily need to know how my oil paint is made. I just want to make sure that the picture that it draws is beautiful, right? Whereas I'm the guy that's like, well, tell me more about the oil paint. Like that's just the difference there between right brain, left brain, right?
Yeah, that really makes sense. And just to narrow down, right? Like with has your like writing software style changed? Like how do you balance now, right? So this is like for folks who are starting out, right? Like I'm a junior engineer, I'm like graduated, I learned all this stuff, and I'm trying to like balance learning versus trying to do the outputs. Like, do you have any like concrete tips, even with an example of a coding tool and how you suggest somebody going about this?
Yeah, I think it's tough now. Every generation, and I know that I'm not the first person to use this example. Every generation, technology has abstracted away more from the hardware, right? Like back in the 50s, everyone was writing punch cards. It's actually a fun like it's even the terms we use today, people don't know where they come from. So punch cards back in the day used to actually have like physical cards where you punch out little holes in the card, and those were the bits, right? Well, what did you call the little bin that all the bits, the hole punches fell into? It was called a bit bucket. So Bitbucket actually comes from punch cards. Anyways, but everything is abstracted away from the hardware. So it was punch cards, and then came assembly language to C, C to C++. Let's say C++ to Java. Let's say Java to JavaScript or other kind of runtime based languages to now instead of programming a computer in a language, I'm programming it that gets compiled down to a machine language. I'm programming it in plain natural language, and it outputs a higher level language that then gets either compiled at runtime or JITted or whatever. And so for people starting off today, I think to give you advice that would have worked 2 years ago would not be fair because the world is completely different now. Like even the way I work is completely different. I think it's really coming down to that understanding how to give proper instruction, right? I think this is where, and when it comes to proper instruction, I'm not saying like just a prompt engineer. I'm saying like, I go back to my example of kind of understanding the technical side of things and what's happening. So like if I'm talking with Claude, for example, Claude Code, and I'm writing something in Python that I want to be more scalable, I'll say, hey, instead of doing this in separate threads, let's use the task runtime with a semaphore to limit the number of concurrent tasks that might be running. Again, knowing what a semaphore is, knowing how the task parallel libraries work versus physical threads, like those are things, but knowing how to properly instruct Claude and not just leave it up to the AI to figure out the entire solution, right? I find a lot of folks try to prompt their way around that, whether they have like an architect skill or a code review skill that has all this stuff in there. At the end of the day, it's funny when I find people who've told me that they're struggling with coding tools and AI, that, oh, it's not doing a good job or it's not doing what I want it to do. It's kind of like NASCAR, where I know every car in the race is exactly the same. It has to be the same horsepower, the same parts. It has to be the same everything. Whether you come in first or whether you come in last is literally up to the skill of the driver. So when a race occurs and wherever you place tells me more about you than it does about the car. And I feel the same way about AI, where if someone's saying, oh, AI produces poor results or this coding agent isn't doing what I want it to do, tells me more about how you are prompting it, how you are utilizing it than the actual AI model itself, right? Because I can tell you, like, I've had instances where I can make Claude sing and make some very beautiful code. And there's been instances where one time, just by accident, I trusted it to deploy migrations, and I had the situation where it blew away my database and was like, "Oops, do you have a backup?" I'm like, "What the heck?" You know, in those situations, like, I could easily blame it on the tool, but it really comes down to how you prompt it. So again, the more concrete example I give people today is really understanding how to give that instruction, right? Is how that is the most valuable tool these days, period. End of story, right? A classic example we would give when we first started working with LLMs, 4 or 5 years ago, was the example with kindergartners. You'd ask them, like, give me instructions for creating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? And you'd have a jar of peanut butter and a jar of jelly and a bag of bread on the table. And you say, okay, give me step-by-step instructions on how to create a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And the kindergartner would, more often than not, first instructions, all right, first you take the peanut butter and you put it on the bread. So I grab the jar of peanut butter and I set it on the bread, and they're like, no, no. It's like, so, just like with AI and LLMs, the best advice I can give anyone these days is really learn how to prompt as a technician, as a developer, not as a product person saying, "Hey, I need this feature." When you're working with a coding tool, you want to give it more instruction of, like, "Here's how I want you to architect the code. Here's how you should structure the code. Here's how I want my unit tests laid out. Maybe here are the libraries I would like you to implement." Knowing that and knowing how to prompt, I think, is the number one skill any software developer from senior architect to just out of university will need to know these days.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree because I think one thing people, even just the underlying architecture of LLMs is such that if you say, just as an example, if you ask it to go and implement like, an email system, let's say, what it'll really do is like take the libraries which are most optimized or like the libraries that are most like available on the web and use those. But the thing is that might not be the best, right? Like the how it, I feel like people should go about it at the very least is to like ask for options or go and do some research and try to do reading and then augment that versus just like, I feel like people have this, they just want to like ask it to do it and then they just want to go with whatever it gave. And I think, it's something that people don't understand is like it's a probability engine, right? And it'll, whatever it's pre-trained on is what it'll spit out, and it might not be the best, right? And so I totally see,
Yeah,
I
we
totally.
we joke we joke us older crowd, we joke is like, remember that code that you have on GitHub that's 8 years old and you're so embarrassed to go look at? Yeah, that's what Claude Codex were trained on.
Yeah, exactly, right? Exactly, right? And like if it was that perfect, then you just prompt it once and you get an entire system built for you, right? If it was that perfect. People say, oh, it might get there, but I still think that the systems right now that work, they're like very much optimized on just that one thing. It's not very broad. I
Mhm.
feel like there's some overhype there where like you're like, oh, one shot this thing and get it done.
But again, I go back to the example. I think it's growing your skill as a driver, as a NASCAR driver, right? Like, again, you're in the same car, but you're in a different class. It's learning how to better drive your car, drive the same hardware, learning how to better use that tool better. And again, it's one of those things where I wish I could say, like, oh, this is the IDE you should be using. This is the, I very much view tooling these days like if I owned a plumbing company, like, look, I'm not going to tell you what wrenches you need. I'm not going to tell you what screwdrivers you need. Use the ones that help you do your job the best. That's it. And every job is different. And everyone, how they approach it is different. So, like, I know there's I love, I used to trying to get JavaScript developers to use an IDE back in the day was like trying to tame a wild horse. Like, they were using, I think Atom was the text editor of choice everyone was using back in the day. And then Visual Studio Code came out and everyone loved VS Code, and it's like, all right, well, I'm happy with that. So whether it's VS Code or IntelliJ or whatever it is, I'm just happy that people are using the tools and that it's just, learning to use that tool you're using well.
I know, totally. So I want to shift gears to like people management. Right? I think this is where like I think I'm also trying to learn and trying to get better at as I go on to work with other people, trying to get into leadership. What is that? Do you have like a leadership mantra of some sort? Because you've led teams, you've had managers work under you. Like how do you get people to be motivated and like work and try their best, right? Like, because like everyone has a leadership style. I last time I did a podcast with somebody I had enjoyed working at as well, and he had like this servant leadership style of which was interesting. It aligned with his philosophy. Like, how do you have like some sort of mantra or like an approach that really you found worked for you?
When it comes to leadership, I always tell people, like, you just gotta keep it simple, right? You want to be the leader that you would want to work for, right? And I think that trying to have that empathy really for the people that are entrusting their careers to you, right? And having that empathy and realizing, like, am I being the leader these people need right now, right? And there are lessons in there, right? Like a perfect example, and I think having mentors and people that can help you see yourself and not just like hold up a mirror, but like kind of see how other people see you helps, right? Like I had a situation one time at a previous organization. As a software developer background, our teams were struggling. Our market data provider had changed their format and the library they sent us wasn't working. So over the weekend, I came in, I reverse engineered the entire protocol, wrote a new library. And like on the Monday morning, I gave my team, like, here you go. Like I fixed the problem here. Like I thought I was doing them this huge favor. And my CIO called me in and he's like, hey, like you really, while you solved this temporary problem, you didn't do the team any big favors. And I was like, why is that? He's like, because they have no ownership of the solution now. That's Eric's solution. That's Eric's. And so having someone around you in growth and leadership that could help you grow like that, I think helps really kind of, because that's where I thought like, oh, that's what I would want to do as a software developer, but that wasn't what I would want my leader to do as a software. Like I would want to try to solve this problem myself as the tinkerer, as the person who wants to know. So with leadership, and again, for those who have children, it is a lot like trying to teach a kid how to ride a bike, where they're gonna fall. They're gonna fall. Kids they're gonna fall off their bike, and you can be there to try to help them. You can help them up. You can dust them off, but at some point, you have to let go of the bike and see if they can pedal on their own. And with teams, it's the same way. Where like I'm not gonna let a team pedal their bike in front of a bus, but I will like kind of control it where it's like, all right, this is a calculated risk. I'm going to see how you folks can do, and I will be here to help pick you up and dust you off. I'm not going to sit there and hold the bike for you and run down the road with you. Like I got to see you. And so being the leader that your teams need and that you would want, I think is the one kind of just guiding principle, my North Star in any technology department, and it's tough sometimes. It is tough. Like you're given organizational priorities that might not align with your personal beliefs or your personal, just the way you want to drive the organization. And some people get lost in that too, where it's like you see a manager like, God, that manager is a real asshole. Like, why were they doing that? It's like, well, they were getting organizational pressure, and they felt like they couldn't fight against it for one reason or another. And I think that, earlier in my career, I could have handled some situations better, when it came to leadership, whether I was fighting against an organization. I remember, just picking your battles and being smart about it. Like, for example, I worked for a brokerage firm that got purchased by a large bank. And I remember in the first meeting, again, it was a brokerage firm. I'm not saying it was Wolf of Wall Street, but, we were pretty hard partying bunch. And so it was like after the day had closed, the market had closed, the CIO for the bank had called a meeting with my tech teams, and we go to this meeting. And I sit down in there and I crack open a beer in front of the CIO of this major bank. And, because that was our office culture at the time. Probably not the smartest thing I ever did in my career. But at the time, I wanted to let the team know, like, look, like we're still going to be us. And again, that caused a lot of problems. And looking back, I might have taken a different path. But like that's one of the things where it's like, choose your battles, be smart about it. But again, never lose sight of your background and who you are and what you want to be as a leader.
See, yeah, I think that kind of explains it. Like I think the hardest part I find is like, you kind of being an engineer, like, and then you go up, and it's like you have this 5, 6 people who are working and that report to you, right? It's like if they screw up, you still have to own it, right? Like that I think that I find it like that sounds tough, the way I think about it. How do you deal with that? Like somebody's not doing well, and like you wanna. How do you? What's your strategy? Like usually, how do
Yeah.
you?
I'll say this: a growth point I've had to get over, especially in leadership positions and technology leadership, is really accepting solutions that work. Right? Maybe it might not be what I would have done, but it works. I'm like, okay, it's not what I would have done, but it works. And in the American South, there's an old saying that it might look stupid, but if it works, it ain't stupid. Same thing with software. So when I would first earlier on in my career, I struggle with that where it's like, oh my gosh, this person's not doing the solution the way it is in my head. They're not doing it right, and they need my help to do it right. And it wasn't they weren't doing it right; it's just they weren't doing it the way I thought it should be done. And I think that's where a lot of leaders earlier on in the career, and I struggle with it as well, is that is it wrong or is it just not what you would be doing? Is this person struggling or is this person just not approaching the problem like you would? And being able to know those situations and when you need to step in to help course correct, or maybe you need to maybe more support, like, all right, I'm going to support you. I want to see where this solution goes. I want to see where you can get with this. I think is an important lesson for folks, in their career, especially when you're dealing with people who you might think are struggling or you might think aren't doing a good job or aren't good. It's like, okay, are they truly struggling or is it just not what I would do? And that goes back to, again, kind of being able to step outside of yourself and look at the situation from a third person perspective of like, okay, given that person the situation, what's actually happening here, is a big lesson in leadership and a big lesson that, even to this day, like I struggle with, right? I struggle with Claude, it's like, Claude, what are you doing? Like, that's not how I would have written that solution, but I guess it works. Yeah. Like, like
Mm,
things like that. I mean, but that is definitely a big point I give to anyone when you're dealing with someone you feel is struggling, your feeling isn't doing well, is to really take back and assess why you feel that way. Is it truly a situation of poor performance, or is it just a situation of maybe you not recognizing the performance?
I see. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, sometimes it's not the way you thought it should be, but it's probably correct or it's a different approach. Yeah. So right now, right, one of the other things I want to ask about is hiring, right? Like the way interviews are done, in the past, where like you could give a coding challenge to somebody and get them to write the code, and now like it's like, oh, take home assignments. Like, what's your hiring strategy? Just that you feel like feels more relevant. I don't know if it's changed because of AI or not, but just has anything changed in your hiring philosophy?
I think looking at hiring and how I've always traditionally done it is that hiring and let's say interview. Let's talk interviewing specifically. Interviewing for me has always been more about having a conversation, right? Like I've never been a big believer in cognitive tests or whiteboard problems. I've never been able to correlate someone doing well on a coding exam to being an actual good software developer. It's kind of the difference between high school and college in the United States these days, where high school teaches towards an exam. They want to teach you, do you retain this knowledge? Do you know these facts? College is where you go to learn how to think critically about problems, how to assess, problems and think analytically about things. And I find through conversation, you can get more of that out of people than solve for X. Interviewing is a skill. I always say it's like speed dating sometimes. Like if you meet someone in a bar, you kind of know within the first 5 minutes whether you're compatible or not, maybe.
Yeah.
I feel the same way when I'm interviewing someone. I kind of know in the first 5 minutes whether this is going to work or not. And unfortunately, that's more qualitative than quantitative as far as interviewing skill go. But it's definitely like I think having a conversation with someone is more important. Like, hey, like I always ask someone like, tell me about yourself. I always let the candidate guide the conversation. Tell me about yourself. What do you like working on? What are your interests? Oh, you like working in computers. Cool. Like, what was the last computer thing you worked on? Oh, awesome. You built this software. Tell me about the software you built. Oh, cool. You built that technology. Tell me more about how you implemented that to like kind of start drilling down from there. And we used to always say that we always use to preface interviews like, we're going to ask you questions that you might not even know the answer to. We're just going to see how deep these waters are, right? And we always wanted to see if there was a point where you would say, I don't know, right? We always wanted to see if you'd reach that point, because when I'm dealing with a production issue, when I am dealing with a customer calling us who's freaking out and it's a big client, and I ask the team for potential solutions, I don't want someone making up a solution on the spot they're not sure of because they want to appear smart. I want someone who's humble enough to be like, you know what? I don't know. I don't know yet, but I will go find out. Right. And a former mentor of mine used to say that, I don't know are probably the three biggest trust building words you can use in any business setting, because it's me telling you like, look, I'm not going to bullshit you. I don't know the answer here, right? So we always used to use our interviews. We used to drill down and we kind of wait for us to say I don't know, and it was sad's not the right word, but it was kind of embarrassing for everyone when it's like we get down to the super low level where I know you're not giving me the right answers. Like we know that the answers you're giving us are wrong, but you're being very confident, almost like an LLM. You're confidently wrong in your responses, right? And we were just always disappointed that you wouldn't say I don't know. And so yeah, so like we always use the conversational style for it, and then we'd always ask something really silly at the end of it, like like all right, like everyone uses SSL, like HTTPS for example. Yeah, oh yeah, I use that all the time. Cool. How does it work? It's like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, well, you use it all the time. You use it every day. Every application you build. How does it work? How does this foundational thing work? How does explain to me how asynchronous encryption or asymmetric encryption actually works? And people are like, I don't know. Like, perfect. I would be hoping that they would like maybe they take an attempt at it, but at the end of the day, it's like, you know what? I don't know. And so yeah. For me, hiring is all about finding the right individual that you'd want to work with, but also finding someone who's humble, who's curious, who you could have that conversation with. And that's more important to me than always. Again, I always tell people like, we can train monkeys to fly spaceships like that we did in the 50s, right? I could teach anyone to do anything. I want to know who you are and what you're about. And I could teach you to do anything after that point.
Wow, I love that. Like, I think a lot of people think that saying I don't know is like a wrong thing. And I think it's some misguidance there, right? I think it's important to say that. I learned that myself. I thought saying I don't know makes you feel inferior in some way. But then I realized like the experts know what they don't know. I think I read that somewhere. Like the
I
experts don't
always, I
know.
always, I always say the hallmark of a senior developer from a junior developer isn't knowing everything. It's knowing when to ask for help. Right? That is the hallmark of a senior technologist, is not someone who's going to spend 3 days working on a problem. It's someone who's going to spend 3 hours on it and be like, I need help. Like, I'm not going to spend any more time on this. I need someone to come in and help me with this. That is the true hallmark of a senior individual, is not knowing everything. It's knowing when to ask for help, knowing when to say, I don't know, I need help.
Yeah, that. I think that's like a really big highlight. I think like this is something that when I think, oh, I'm like, yeah, I've never explicitly thought about this, but it's so on point. Like it's so on point. Um, post hiring, right? Let's say we found that person. How do you how do you get them to ramp up in your org, right? You want them to feel comfortable. You want to build that trust. You want to like get them to be familiar with the system. Do you have any tips around that?
I think it's just, again, having the empathy for it. Like, I remember at the brokerage I worked at, we used to say, like, look, for the first 2 weeks, I don't expect anything out of you. I don't expect you to pick up any Jira tickets. I expect you to get your sea legs under you, figure out how our processes work. Again, the team is operating at a certain wavelength and you're kind of out of sync right now. We got to figure out how to get you in sync. So that way, you kind of integrate with the team. There's a family therapist from the 70s. Her name was Virginia Satir, and she had the Satir change process model. And it was an early version of the forming, storming, norming, performing, right? But the concept is that if you introduce a change into any system, no matter how small the change, it will impact the performance of that system, right? So when you're onboarding a new person on your team, you want to try to minimize, number one, the impact of the existing team and their productivity, right? I mean, like, you don't want the new person checking in code that blows up everything and everyone has to rally around it. But you also want them to feel productive, that they're contributing, right? So it's figuring out how best to align them. I have found that, again, it's so funny. Everything has changed over the last 2 years with AI and everything else that's really come in the development space. But it's the idea of how do we sort of start familiarizing with what we're working on, giving them low stakes examples. Like, hey, is there something low stakes? Like the example used to be back in the days, like, hey, can they make a CSS change, right? Go in there. So familiarize themselves with a smaller low stakes part of the system. They can push a small change in there. They can go through the change control process, see how it gets deployed out to different environments, track the ticket through. Like, especially if you're at a larger company, you have the opportunity for that, is finding those low stakes. And then, the next ticket, maybe a little higher stakes, different part of the system. Start trying to teach them different parts of the system where, again, you're trying to get their wavelength in sync with the team, but not also impacting the productivity of the team. We know it's going to impact. Again, the change process model tells us there's nothing we can do to not impact the productivity of the team, but figuring out is how to minimize the impact as much as we can while helping the team then figure out what the new normal is with this new team member coming in, whether it's an additional capacity, maybe they bring some different skills to the table. But yeah, I think that's usually how I approach it on a post-hire basis, is again, not having the audacity to be surprised that it impacts the productivity of the team that you join. It's not their fault. It's going to happen in any system, but it's really figuring out strategically, how do we onboard the person, lower stakes, really the goal is to get them familiar with your process and get that kind of wavelength in sync with the team.
I see. Yeah, I think that kind of makes, yeah, that makes sense. Related to that is, I was trying to think about like how, you've probably seen waterfall coming through. I don't know if you experience what they used to call
Oh yeah.
waterfall. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I never saw waterfall.
I have had a 600-page specification set down on my desk, and like, all right, Eric, you're doing page 65 to 85.
Wow, that's crazy. Like, yeah, I never saw that world, but I did, I understand the sprint world, right? Like the sprint, 2 week, 3 week sprint. So that came about because, partly it's like software is easier to deploy. Like you didn't have to ship them in CDs, right? You could do on-demand changes, shorter cycles of delivery, right? And that kind of worked. And like, now we have more cadence. So do you think that should affect, is there anything do you feel like intuitively like there would be a change in the way software is shipped? Maybe because it's shipped faster, or maybe it doesn't affect it. Do you have any opinions on that?
I think again, it's so funny how much the world has changed in the last 2 years. So like I'm an agilist at my core. I lived in the waterfall world in the late 90s, early 2000s. I saw the transition from waterfall to agile. I could not have been more excited to see that. I think agile was ruined by consultants. I think the agile industrial complex came in and put more value around process. Again, the whole point of agile, the whole point was to put the people who were doing the work closer to the people who were using the output of the work. Like, let's get our customers and our developers more closely connected where we can synthesize that feedback faster and get things out to our customers faster for them to look at it and give us feedback. The way we know how to build everything kind of came from the Industrial Revolution. That's where, waterfall and these kind of assembly line processes came from. But like when you were building a railroad, nobody kind of came out on the railroad after the track was laid and said, you know what? If we change the rail to go this way, we get a better view of the mountains like after it's built. But that happens in software all the time, right? So the
Yeah.
processes that we had in place for building software with Waterfall didn't work in sort of a software and an internet-enabled world. So that's where Agile came from. So I always say that, throw that out there, that I think Agile has gotten a really bad rep because of the Agile industrial complex. I think SAFe, for example, single-handedly killed Agile. But looking at how things are done now, so this is where things get really interesting because we talk about a user story in an agile organization. We used to say that a user story was just a promise for a conversation. It's not a specification. It's a kind of a rough outline. And I expect that the human developer is going to go talk to the human product owner, and the human product owner might pull in the human stakeholders or the human customers to all have a conversation to figure out what needs to be built. But now the AI agent is writing the code. The AI agent's probably writing the user stories. We're probably tracking our customers' usage through a third-party tracking tool that's giving us analytics that's feeding into an automated system, right? So there's not a lot of human interaction now. So what's funny is I'm seeing a reversing where people are writing users, like we have product owners using AI, whether it's Claude Cowork or Copilot or one of those. They're writing user stories, but the user stories are very long, like a specification, because they're not getting a chance to converse with the AI agent. That specification is getting turned around and dropped into Codex or Claude Code to get done, and the developer's turning around and saying, okay, that's done now. And it's like, well, hold on, I didn't get a chance to review it. I used to love this is probably back in like 2010, 2011, 2012, but an agile organization where I would literally see like my product owners, my QA person, and my developers all huddled around someone's monitor because they were all collaborating on building out a feature and like, oh, let's put that there. Or now that I see it, maybe we move the button there. Or can we do this? Can you test this? Like kind of that collaboration. Well, now with AI, it's your AI agents collaborating with each other and doing that collaboration now, right? Like there's no more human aspect to it. So I still see value in rapid deployment and rapid integration, right? Like, because especially if your AI agents are doing something wrong, you want to know early and often. That's still one principle I really think still applies today. It's really figuring out where to inject the most important thing we have in the building as far as building anything is our brain, the human brain, right? Is where do we inject this in the process? Like if agents are writing the code and agents are reviewing the code and agents are QAing the code and agents are deploying the code, where do we inject the human in that process? And I think the answer for that is probably different for every organization depending on the product you're building. But I think the principles of Agile, like I said, are still there where as long as we can deploy incrementally, where we don't let the agents disappear for 3 days, write 20,000 lines of code and deliver a product where it's like, well, that's totally wrong. Like it comes down to how do we make the units of work small enough that we're deploying automatically through an AI enabled system where a human could still review it and give the feedback and not have that be a huge amount of rework. Because you read stories these days of organizations where their agents run awry and they rack up thousands of dollars in Anthropic API costs because their agents are going nuts. I mean, we used to joke back in the day that was the AWS problem where you had like a service run awry that spun up all these instances and you have a huge AWS bill. It's again, the older you get, the more the world is it's the same play, different actors, right? So instead of AWS costs going nuts now it's AI and Anthropic costs going nuts because something ran away. But I think that's kind of where I would go with it when I guide organizations there is you still want to deliver incrementally in an automated fashion and early as often as you can, but you still want to be able to have that feedback loop back even to your AI system of, hey, let's change this. Hey, let's make this work differently, and still give yourself the opportunity to do that. A kind of long answer, but it's one of those things where I think the world is really changing under our feet right now about how processes work. And I think traditional Agile doesn't necessarily work in an AI enabled world, but I don't know necessarily what does. And so that's why I kind of tell people these days, like, whatever works for your company, that's the best solution.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. But there's some principles around like reviewing the work which makes sense, right? If the piece of work is really large to review and there's gonna be human error because if you make an error on the review side, then you're gonna ship stuff that you find out later about that is not what you intended. And I feel like the best way is probably to like have smaller pieces of work which are reviewable because like at the end of the day, like I think right now the bottleneck is reviewing. And so at the very least, I feel like people could spend time maybe reviewing and testing more. At least from my experience shipping, the software, I feel like in this time, I feel like that's where the bottleneck is. It's like reviewing, and I noticed a larger piece, like the larger the piece of work was, the harder it was mentally to review it to find a mistake. So I totally agree with it's a balance, but maybe there'll be more custom ways of managing projects depending on the teams and you know yeah,
Yeah,
I think.
I think your point is valid, and I think I've seen an example of that recently with an organization. A friend of mine who's a CIO for an organization, they've recently over the last 6 months moved their teams to using Anthropic and Claude Code, and he's like, we're getting features delivered at a breakneck speed, but now our QA process is falling behind. We cannot test these features that are being delivered so fast. But so our the processes for QA haven't, I think, necessarily caught up to how rapidly these AI systems can deliver features. And again, I don't have if I had a solution for that, I'd write a book and make a fortune. I don't have a solution for that, but I think your point is valid. Is that we're having to rethink existing processes because maybe traditional QA processes aren't going to work in a post AI world.
Yeah, I agree. I think even like, drilling down further, I feel like I thought about it and I feel like agents suck at like the end, like at the end, right? Like where, let's say they have to validate using a browser. Like there is efforts, but I do feel like the agents suck at it to a good extent. And that's why even computer use, like, is something that's coming up, maybe could be leveraged to automate some QA work, but I do feel like they're not yet like at the speed where you can build, right? Like the validation isn't at the same, the intelligence isn't at the same level is what I feel like, from what
Yeah.
I've observed, right?
Yeah, I mean, you see organizations who might have extensive Selenium testing frameworks. You see organizations trying to have Claude write playwright scripts. And again, it can tell you if there's an error, but it cannot tell you if it looks right. Like that's where I always tell people again that the best testing tool we have in the building is between our ears. And there was an old paper out there that talks about the 4 quadrants of agile testing. This is from 2006. It's old. But it breaks testing into 4 quadrants. Going clockwise on the bottom left, it's fully manual testing, and then a mix of automated and manual testing, fully automated testing, and then your last quadrant is like external third-party utilities, pen tests, third-party things. And it makes the case that every organization starts in manual. And every organization should work towards pushing the needle to push the needle clockwise. Right? Like, all right, you have to start with fully manual tests. Then you work to get your tests a mix of automated and manual, and then as many tests as you can fully manual. But it's not you're only in one of those things. You might be 90% in manual, and then you're 90% in manual and 10% on manual and automated. Then you're 70% 10-10. Then you're like 60, 20-20, right? But to your point, I don't think there will ever be a day where there's not a manual test where a user has to look at a web page and be like, this looks right. I had product people back in the early 2000s literally send me defects saying, hey, this box needs to be moved 3 pixels to the right. Not even joking, you know? And that's not something I would expect in any computer vision platform or AI to get. But that's something that a product person be like, this just doesn't look right to me as a human. So I think that, to your point, I think we haven't figured out sort of the post AI testing world, but I think some of the older principles still apply.
Yeah, I think that totally aligns. Yeah, and I think we're toward the end of the podcast. I just had one of the last questions, then maybe just any add-ons you have. But one of the things that I'm trying to build on as well is to learning how to communicate with external parties like customers, for example, right? Typically it's like there's no warming there, right? In the sense that you go into a meeting and you're trying to like establish that connection. Like, do you have any tips and tricks on like how people can better work with customers, or you found like tips that work to improve that process? Because the thing is, you have an objective of like you want to befriend them, sure, but you also want to tie the value to the product you're building, right? So how do you do that?
So I'll preface this with saying I'm terrible at sales. I'm not a good salesperson at all. Like again, I know being CEO of a startup, that's a poor opening statement, but I am terrible at sales because I've been on the other side of it for so long as an executive of people trying to sell into me. And I find in business, and I find this true in any area in business, is building that interpersonal relationship, whether you're trying to sell into a company or not, building that relationship, like having that conversation, building that interpersonal relationship. And again, from my background in consulting, I found this helped me even more than trying to sell into an organization, where being able to have that friendly conversation with someone, establish that relationship, I think goes a long way. Even these days, like if I'm talking to someone, I hope their takeaway is like, wow, like that was a great conversation. Whether I'm going to buy it or not, that was a great conversation. I liked having that conversation because that means when I call that person again, they're going to pick up. There was an executive coach I worked with at an organization years ago. His name is Lex Sisney. His whole thing is around organizational physics. He treats interactions like physics, and the energy can be created or destroyed, kind of thing, right? And he talks about people being, are you an energy drain or an energy gain? There's a finite amount of energy in the system. So when I interact with you, do I feel like I am gaining energy, or do you feel like I am expending energy in the interaction, right?
Right.
And if it's someone that you feel you're expending energy with, you're probably not going to want to spend time with them, because it's like you see the name pop up in your phone. You're like, oh, I don't want to talk to them right now. Like, because it's going to cost me energy to have that conversation. And so I always say, like, try to be that energy gain. Like, have people, if you're an energy gain, they're going to answer you the phone. They're going to want to go have drinks with you. They're going to want to go get lunch. That's where I feel is sort of that almost pre-sale, right? Like, I'm not even trying to sell you, and I'm really trying to sell myself. Like, hey, like, I'm a good guy. I'm a personable guy. We can have this conversation, and then business will flow naturally from there. I always say, like, the first thing you're always selling is yourself. You're always selling yourself first and foremost, and then whatever company you're with follows that, right? And
Right.
so learn how to sell yourself. Learn how to be a good, personable person. Learn how to be someone that what do they used to call it at Google, like the layover question? Like, would I want to be stuck at a 6-hour layover with this person? Try to be that person, you know?
Right, right. Wow, that's amazing. That's like a meta skill, right? I feel like I need to rewatch this whole thing. And is there anything else you'd like to add, closing? Like,
No, I mean, you know what? This is great. Again, I love the conversation. I think that, interpersonal conversations, there's not a lot of these days. You even see people kind of getting executive advice and coaching through LLMs.
uh,
So I think podcasts like yours and these types of conversations are important for us as an industry. Again, I still have people that I talk to on a daily basis that I view as my mentors and people that can help me. It's always a question. It's always a, do I ask the meta expert, or do I go call a friend? And I'm the kind of person, I'm going to call a friend first. And I've had people kind of say, like, why don't you just Google that? I'm like, well, because I want to ask you first. So I appreciate the opportunity to kind of share the experience and advice, and I think what you're doing is very important. And I hope people take something from this.
yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I started this with the intent of, you know, when I was starting out, right, at different phases, I kept looking for like real conversations. I felt like engineers who are like trying to build or trying to do something, like there wasn't just like enough content, right? I saw like the representation, but like the technical talks and like, the idea of somebody trying to level up or trying to understand things, I didn't find so much. I was like, maybe I'll have those conversations myself with people that I've worked
Yeah.
with and that I admire, and then I'm gonna share that. Fortunately, people reached out to me, and it's like 3 people or 4 people who found like it really changed the way they do things, and for me, I think that was I felt like okay, I should keep doing this. So I really appreciate that you joined the podcast today.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks everyone. Thank you for watching.